Everyone in. 57. Welcome in, everyone. Welcome to Care Concierge with Care Patrol, where education is the heart of everything that we do. As you're joining us today, everyone, I want to ask you, if you will, if you're able, if you're at a desk or have a pad in your hand, please take an 8.5 by 11-inch sheet of paper, because today, Dr. Phyllis Mark, who has her doctorate in psychiatry from Yeshiva University, which is affiliated with Einstein Medical Center, is going to teach us the genogram and how we might use that in self-assessment to provide better care for others and, of course, for ourselves. So as you know, or as you may not know, some of you may be new with us, and if so, welcome to Care Concierge. Care Patrol is an aging care navigation firm. And what that means pretty simply is that if you sort of meld some of the elements of social work and some of the elements of real estate, you get what we do, which is we try and understand people's needs, meet them where they are, and help them get to where they're going by sharing resources and education with them. And education is the heart of what we do at Care Patrol. We're so happy to have you here today. I know we have a lot of people who've registered, and I think some of you are new. We're so pleased to have you join us and to have our speaker, Dr. Phyllis Mark, who will provide us with this topic. And I know you're looking forward to it, as I am. Intro to the Genogram, Healer, Know Thyself. So I hope you are rummaging around your space to find a piece of paper and a pen so that we can work with Dr. Mark to draw our own genogram today. And as I say that, I'm realizing I don't have a paper or pen in front of me, so I might excuse myself in a minute. Those of you who've been with us know we encourage discussion. However, because this is kind of technical, Dr. Mark would prefer that unless you have a how-to question, that we talk about things at the end. We do allow you, of course, at any time to ask, and we encourage you to ask questions in the chat room, excuse me. I feel that our voices are enhanced by yours, by your personal experience, by your expertise, your clinical practice. If you're new to Zoom and you're not familiar with the chat, move your cursor up to the top of your screen. If nothing happens, move it to the bottom. A bar will appear with the word chat. Click on it and join us, please, in the discussion. We use an evaluation process that is online and is password protected. We give the password out at the end of the presentation, and I'll give the link out now and again at the end for those of you who would like to make note of it on the 8.5 by 11-inch piece of paper that you have. The address is https://www.surveymonkey.com/r/ all uppercase letters 6 F as in Frank, W, 9, Q, H as in Harry, B as in ball. That's our evaluation link. We're accredited by the Alabama Board of Social Work and also by the Alabama Board of Nursing. Nurses who are attending will post your hours for you, and everyone who completes that evaluation link that I gave will receive a certificate and credit for today's hour. We do, again, encourage you to participate, ask questions, and participate today by getting your paper and pen ready to learn about yourself. Dr. Phyllis Mark is going to meet these 3 objectives for us today. Our first is to learn the value of genograms when doing clinical assessments. And the second objective is for you to see how your work may be subject to the influences of both your current and your intergenerational family influences. Fascinating. Our third objective is to deepen the awareness that your patient's clients may have values, beliefs, communication styles, etc., which need to be appreciated during your assessment of them. Dr. Mark had asked me to send out an email, which I did, of the various genogram symbols. Now, we won't go into these today, but I want to give you a sense by viewing these slides of sort of what these symbols look like. And there are, of course, a host of them, and we won't go into all of them today. Instead, we're going to be more hands-on as Dr. Phyllis Mark who will lead us through the following slides. Thank you so much for doing this, Dr. Mark. I'm truly deeply appreciative.
Well, thank you, Sean, for inviting me this afternoon. I am very pleased to be here, and I'm sorry we won't be able to have that much interaction, but I hope that I will answer some of your questions as we go along, and I look forward to hearing your questions at the end. Just know this is the first time I have done a hands-on project with people over Zoom, so we may be learning this together. So we'll see how it works. Anyway, I wanted just to tell you the purpose of my presentation, which is to talk about the genogram, as Sean mentioned, which is a very versatile tool in both clinical assessments and interviews and ongoing treatment. It's also a chance for us to look at ourselves in context so we can offer more insights into how we interact with patients and clients and what our assumptions might be that we need to review before we jump in and expect others to be the same as we are. So after a brief overview of the genogram and its uses, I hope you'll be able to start drawing on your own. I've written some guidelines that will help, and we'll do this together. You don't have to know all those symbols, okay? Those are references, and we're going to do some very basic symbols today. So please do not be intimidated by how many there are. You can look at them in the future and use them as a reference if you continue using the genogram. And many of you may have even started doing the genogram, hopefully, based on what I sent. So you'll be ahead of the game, but we'll add to it as we go along. And you don't have to be the family historian for this, okay? Just know that whatever you know is sufficient. And not knowing is an interesting fact unto itself. So, so just be aware of that, but you may notice patterns in your own history as you make this diagram up, and that can be important to how you gather data from your patients and clients. I'm going to finish the presentation before our questions with my genogram and just give you a kind of example of how by the way, I'm a psychologist, not a psychiatrist. I've got my doctorate in psychology, and why I became a psychologist in essence. But anyway, so we'll start with the definition of the genogram, which is that it's a diagram which identifies a person's family members or significant relationships and how they're related, and other information such as medical history, communication patterns, values, psychological factors that system members may share. It's a tool that's become commonly used in family therapy, and the work that I'm presenting to you is based on a book that is listed at the top of my first slide there. It's called Genograms, Assessment and Intervention by Monica McGoldrick, Randy Gerson, and Susan Schellenberger. This is kind of the Bible, if you will, and of genograms, and it's fascinating because they have genograms in there of Franklin Roosevelt and Alexander Bell and Sigmund Freud, and it's interesting to see how things kind of evolved into who they became. So it's really a fascinating tool. I think of it as a kind of a cross between a family tree, which is obvious, and a Ouija board. Now, I don't know if you guys know what a Ouija board is, but what happens with Ouija boards is after it's set up, you can ask it questions and it kind of gives you answers that you might not even expect. So after we put in static or demographic data, then we can ask questions, and we'll be doing things based on career choice today. That will be the question that we use in looking at the genogram. But anyway, genograms are used as a tool. I know many of you are under time constraints when you're doing your work. You can do a genogram very quickly, and it can be done just with a person's current family relationships and stresses, or perhaps family reactions to the person's medical or psychosocial situation. Or you can do a more involved genogram, which can be constructed and utilized in an extensive way over the course of somebody's treatment. So various issues, of course, arise, like how to convince somebody else to get treatment, or who a patient can rely on if there's a need for personal care, or who moved away. These are questions that can be answered as you and your patient collaborate to make this genogram. Often the information that's focused on is relevant to a specific question, as I mentioned. So this first slide is an example of that. This is an anonymous family, but the shaded areas are indicating people who have abused alcohol. So the major focus here was over and under functioning in family constellations. And if you notice, there's actually 4 generations in this diagram. And squares are men, circles are women, a line that connects the two is a marriage. The lines dropping down are the children. And when there's a more important focus, we make the line a little longer. So this way we can connect that person up with a person from a different family. So there are 2 different families of origin shown here. The one on the left starts off with a marriage between an alcoholic husband and a wife who is a seamstress and supported the family. That's a little note. You can write notes all over these genograms. So she was a seamstress, she supported the family, and they had 1 son who became an alcoholic. And that alcoholic son married a woman without a history of alcoholism in her family, who was a cleaning woman, and she supported the family. Okay, similar to what his mom did. And his role was similar to what his dad was in terms of the alcoholism. And they had 4 children. Of the 4 children, they had 3 sons and 1 daughter. The oldest is always the one to the left, by the way. So the oldest son and the 3rd child, who was a son, were both alcoholic. And 1 son was not, and the daughter was not. The son that we focused on here was alcoholic and unemployed, and married a woman who was a secretary and supported the family. She also went to college, which was wonderful that she was able to do both. But if you notice, this is the 3rd generation of women over functioning, and in this case, men under functioning because of their substance abuse. Now, she had a history, if you look up there, her father was alcoholic, and her maternal grandfather was alcoholic. Her mother was a federal worker. I'm not sure in what capacity, because this is from the book. And she had a sister and a brother, neither of whom were alcoholic. So there was immediate exposure to the alcoholism growing up, but she did not have that problem. I don't know about the codependent piece is all through here, of course, but it's not indicated. And then she and this unemployed alcoholic husband had 4 children, okay? And according to what I read, none of them were alcoholic. But you can look at it very quickly and see the intergenerational patterns here. You can see that the male members of the paternal side of the family were exceedingly susceptible to alcohol addiction. And on the mother's side, it was there, so there was some familiarity with it, but it wasn't quite as prominent and it didn't trickle down quite the same way. But in terms of over-functioning and under-functioning, that's a very important issue for so many of us. And we can make assumptions about the woman over-functioning or the male over-functioning, but this gives tacit evidence about what the difficulties were that this family had to deal with, and how it was a trickle-down experience. It wasn't just this unemployed husband being alcoholic without any kind of context. So this is just an example, and I hope it's a helpful one. Again, please forgive my amateur rendition here. I didn't use a ruler or a compass because I'm just not that way. So I hope that was clear enough for you. But what I want to emphasize most in terms of doing genograms, whatever the situation is that none of us lives in a social vacuum. Very often, I think what happens that people's values or assumptions or fears or their network of support or lack of support play an important role in treatment, but a lot of times that's not assessed. And a person is just looked at in terms of pathology and not in terms of context. So this genogram is a way of allowing the person to be a more whole person and not just the presenting problem and let's get them in and get them out. And again, if you're doing a quick assessment, you might not do as much as this, but you could start the ball rolling and get some information about who the person lives with and different kinds of difficulties in terms of conflict and all of that. There are symbols for showing who lives with whom, and if there's closeness in the relationship or if there's conflict in the relationship, and we'll talk about that later. You know, the thing that I really like also about genograms is it can improve the therapeutic relationship between the therapist or the nurse and the client, because you're looking at this together. And when there's cultural sensitivity in the questions about the person's family, definition of family or customs, it's a way of joining with them and being respectful of their humanity in the context of their lives, not just based on a wristband. I think both clinician and the patient or client, depending what you call them, can view them as a part of a larger entity called the family, which could be good or bad or indifferent, but we all come from somewhere. So it's important to ask respectful questions, and it's always okay to do that. People appreciate being asked rather than the assumptions that can happen, again, when we don't realize that we're coming from our subjective history. So in addition to this way of being curious about observing their own history, helping you to create this, it's interesting to see how patients become family detectives. Sometimes they go back home and they ask questions that they never asked before. Sometimes they start seeing patterns as you're working with them, and you can use different colors to make it a little clearer in terms of different relationships or different historical issues. But people become very involved. And it's really wonderful because you can see them starting to make the connections, and there's no blame here. Okay, which is so important. This is not about you as an authority pointing a finger at somebody and saying, why are you the way you are? This is explaining how this person became who they are, at least in part. It's not the whole enchilada, but it's also a big part of what can give you information. And, the interesting thing is I started doing this because somebody asked me to do my own genogram. And I found that it was helpful for me to do it because it helped me to see myself in a larger context and helped me to understand some of the decisions I've made, even in retrospect, more clearly than when I was actually making them, And I don't know if many of you have done this before. You might have. Sometimes it's included in some social work programs. But we're going to do one that's focused on your career choice. And perhaps you too can see something of yourself in a different light. So what we're going to do is have a focal question, which is, why did I choose my current profession? Okay, so what we're going to do is spend some time creating the genogram and see if any answers arise. So Sean, if you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so again, it's usually a 3-generation diagram, so you have to leave room. It's hard sometimes to fit it all on one paper, so you might even want to use a larger sheet than 8.5 by 11. And as I said, squares are for men, circles are for women. And you have to have room for sides of your both parents' families. So there's actually 4 different relationships at the top. There'll be the mother and father of the father, the mother and father of the mom, did I do that right? No, there are 2. The mother and father of the father and the mother and father of the mother, and then your mother and father, and then you. So those are the 3 generations. Okay, and when you do this, make sure that the oldest sibling in your parents' generation or yours is all the way to the left, and extend the line down from that line where it connects their parents lower, so you can connect the mother and father symbols, or if there's a marriage, it can also be a dotted line. If it was a relationship that was not a marriage, there can also be symbols for divorce or estrangement. This really covers the gamut in terms of ways that you can express a range of relationships. So this is not tied to a conventional heterosexual relationship. Okay, next slide, please. And I hope you're doing this as we're talking. Next, okay. So if you've done that with your mother and father symbols, extend, and they were married, let's say, or they were together for some period of time, so there's a line that connects the 2. Then extend lines downward for you and your siblings. So if you're the oldest, your circle or square should be the one to the furthest left. Okay, and since this is about you, you get 2 circles or 2 squares. Okay, so you stand out. So we know you are that focal point. Okay, and as I said, you can mark any significant change in relationship that occurs even after a birth. You put a two kind of backslash lines after the birth or before the birth. If there have been 2 significant relationships, you can draw an additional line from the person who engaged in the other relationship and make note of that. And if there were other births, let's say, you can put it between those 2 people. So you've got just the children of, let's say, your mother and father under that line. And then if there's another relationship with children, you put the children under that relationship, which is on the far side of the person. I hope that's clear. Okay, next slide, please.
Well, I was going to ask, if you don't mind, if we could go back over 1 and 2, just to make sure everybody's with us.
Okay.
Because
sure.
I'm lost.
Okay.
I usually, when I get lost, I wonder.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so we're going to go back to the first. Okay, so we start with the fact that it's a 3-generation diagram. So towards the top of the page, you put down, let's just say, okay, conventional heterosexual family. You put a square and a circle and a line that connects the 2, which shows that your grandparents were married. Okay. Then you put lines down from that line indicating marriage that indicate each of the offspring from that marriage, with the oldest being the most far left. Okay. And if it's a boy, it's a square. If it's a girl, it's a circle. If there's a miscarriage, it's denoted usually by a little triangle. So you can get on either side of your family, your dad's side, your mom's side, you have the grandparents, right? I was right the first time. Their parents would have 2 sets of, never mind. I think I was doing 4 generations there. Let's stay with 3. Okay, so the mother, same thing. On the other side, comes from somewhere. Let's say it was an intact marriage, circle and square with a line connecting them. and lines drawn down from that marriage line, denoting the number of children they had. Okay, now in my family, both my parents were oldest parents, or were oldest siblings, excuse me. So both my parents were to the far left of that line that denoted my grandparents' respective marriages. Okay, I hope that's clear. And there were no divorces, so there were no other lines there. Okay, let's go to the next one. No, go back. Okay, we did. Okay, we can start here. What we're doing here now, we're putting in names. The dates of birth, it can be just the year, if you know it. If somebody has died, you make an X through their symbol. Often it's helpful to write the cause of death. In my family, for example, there was an uncle who died of a burst appendix when he was a child. And that's relevant in terms of people making choices for healthcare in my family. Separation, divorce, close or cut off relationships. If it was a close relationship, you just draw 2 lines from one person to the other. If it's a cutoff, it would be a squiggly line and a squiggly line with a space between the 2 lines, like actual cutoff, okay? And a cutoff, for those of you who don't know, or when people stop talking to each other. Any geographic origin or migration issues. All 4 of my grandparents were born overseas, so that was relevant in my family. It may be relevant in yours, or maybe they moved from Detroit to Alabama. You know, at a certain point, that would be helpful to know. Religious affiliation and how dedicated or how committed to their religion they are. That could be very helpful. I hope I'm not going too fast, but we have so much. Their education, even if you do some of these, vocation is going to be most helpful for us since we're doing a career-focused genogram. So even if you didn't get all the other ones down, see if you can remember the vocation of your parents and your grandparents, or if there was any problems in terms of them achieving their goal, or their lack of motivation for a vocation. And relevant ethnicity can be helpful as well. Again, cultural norms are not to be assumed. We are all from somewhere different, and we all have our own family and cultural flavors, which makes life very interesting, I think. Also, was there any story relevant to how people were named? Okay, how did you get your name? For example, did you get your name because somebody liked a movie star and they gave you their name? Or were you named after somebody who died, or somebody that was a friend who was special to the person who named you? That information can be helpful, because often when you're named after somebody, there are implicit expectations about you should act like that person in some way. You should fulfill some expectations, perhaps, that person didn't fulfill. Or you can be treated as if you have the same characteristics of that person. Okay, that's a lot. I'll give you a few minutes if you can work with that. And if there's a how-to question in terms of just what to draw on the paper, you can send it to the chat.
So this seems to me, in a way, to be a sort of shorthand, but much more effective, much quicker.
Yeah. So when you're experienced looking at a genogram, you can see the context of a person very quickly. So if I made this genogram and then I'm referring somebody to a psychiatrist, and in that genogram, it shows that this person's father was bipolar and their, brother is schizophrenic, and they're having certain symptoms, the psychiatrist may be able to look at that and think maybe there's a genetic component here. Okay. Or if somebody had a history of depression and you put that down and somebody looks at it, they say, oh, well, if your mother had depression, what medicine did she take? Oh, she took Prozac and it really helped her. So a psychiatrist might be inclined to give you Prozac, because often if you're genetically connected to somebody who did well on a medicine, you might do well on a medicine, just as an example. And I'm using psychiatry just because of the fact that I work in mental health, but this could be other physicians as well, if they bother looking at your notes. Okay. Is that an answer to your question, Sean?
Oh, yeah, it was a great answer. Yeah, I was just thinking how quickly once you learn the shorthand, how quickly you can make an assessment. And one that's not based on appearance, or assumption.
Well, and you can riff a little bit. If somebody looks a certain way and you do this genogram and the way the people are presented in the genogram just seems qualitatively different than your clinical intuition is telling you, that's a reason to ask questions right there. And again, not accusatory, but just I see that there's a difference in the fact that, everybody smokes cigarettes and you don't. Why is that? That may be a question about, habits that people have, and how it trickles down.
Well,
so the most tedious part, the most tedious part of this is just getting the demographic information put in the diagram. And then after that is where the Ouija board element comes in.
Oh, how fun. I thought that might be it. So like in my example, I don't know the answers to any of those questions. So what?
Okay. If you don't have any information, that right there is information.
Okay.
Okay. If you say, I don't know the names of my grandparents or where they were from or what they died from or what they did for a living, then, usually that means that there's been some rupture in the family communication. People moved away, possibly.
I'm adopted, but I can see this, that the opposite
okay, well,
could also be true.
Okay, no, this would be from your adoptive parents then. You would give the information from your it's a good point, from your adoptive family, but the fact that you were adopted needs to be part of the symbols in your genogram. Okay, so then we talk about nature versus nurture issues where you may not know your history biologically, but if your adoptive dad was an entrepreneur, it may have had influence on your decisions to start a business, for example. Okay, so depending on, if you spent your whole childhood and up with your adoptive parents, that would be helpful. If there are foster homes that people are in, there are ways of doing genograms where you can you can show the foster homes that a child has been in, which could be very helpful because very often there's some kind of trauma involved, not very often, probably always, there's some kind of trauma involved in the reason for a child going to foster care and the changes in the foster care and what happens perhaps in the foster care environment. So all those things can be noted on a genogram. Okay, so that's really, really important. Yeah.
So fascinating.
Okay, I'm going to go on. If that's, again, if you haven't gotten this down, it's okay. This is just an exposure. So this way, if you're interested, you can really work on more detailed genograms for yourselves. Okay, so what we're focusing on, the presenting issue, right, as I said, was about your career choice. So when you're doing this genogram, as I said earlier, vocation may be a helpful thing for you to put down with your family members, as long as you know that. In my family, I'll show you later, there's a number of people who have been in the medical profession. My father wanted to be in pharmacy, but he blew up the roof of the little shack they use as a lab when he was in college, and he left school. So he never became a pharmacist, but he wanted so badly to be successful that he pushed my brother into medicine. Okay, so his motivation came from his limitations, but it had an impact on the next generation. Okay, and
Okay.
I'll show that to you. So the actual vocations or changes in vocations, if somebody stayed at home, it's important. Or if somebody wished that they could have done something or had something disruptive happen in their vocational life, it's important to mention that, because there are reasons why we choose what we choose. Okay, we can go to the next one. Okay. That we should actually have flipped these. So a history of trauma is very, very important. Okay. A history of trauma can be symbolized by a number of things that I sent in the list. There's an emotional relationships listing, but absolutely trauma needs to be asked about in the course of the construction of the genogram, just as culture needs to be asked about in the construction of the genogram. And it's much easier when two of you are looking down at a piece of paper to talk about something like that than the usual, face-to-face, almost adversarial kind of interview stance. So you're joining together, looking down, you're collaborating, and it's much easier for people to talk about something or to say, yeah, but I don't want to talk about it now, and that's fine. Okay, but you note it at least. So it's acknowledged. It's very important for that to be acknowledged, and as is the case in any kind of interview or treatment. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay. Are there family stories or values that you recall hearing related to your presenting issue question? Okay, I just shared one with you about my dad who didn't pursue pharmaceutical science because he had an unexpected event happen when he was an undergraduate, and he left college completely, and he worked in the post office for the rest of his career. Okay, so that was important because of what he wanted from his kids. I have one brother, and the emphasis on education was stronger because he felt he regretted the fact that he left school. He had a brother who became an MD, and he was the big shot of the family. So that was why my father lived kind of vicariously through the successes of his kids. And that's important, because when it comes to our motivation for why we do what we do, often it's about family expectations or parental wishes or something that is kind of an implicit message that you've gotten from the various people in your family or people even who've left your family. Or, it doesn't have to be your family. It can be your neighbor who was very important and was a nurse and came in and helped somebody in your family when there was an emergency and nobody else knew what to do. Okay, so that could be a story that could be very important. Another story might be that your patient mistrusts all medical professionals. I've noticed, I'm a New Yorker, as you probably have picked up from my lovely accent. But when I moved to rural Alabama, I was really surprised at how many people mistrusted going to the doctor. It was not a common occurrence when somebody had a need for care to go to the doctor. People would say, my granddaddy was 99 when he died, and he smoked all his life, and he got hit by a car. So I'm not going to the doctor. I'm not going to go check myself out. I'll be fine. Or there's folk medicine involved or something like that. So it's important to ask about people's comfort levels. It's important to talk about or to notice people's style of communication, so you're not talking polysyllabic gobbledygook to somebody who is not used to anything except plain talk. But you don't undertalk them either, okay? This is not about condescending. This is trying to just regulate yourself so you're on a frequency that is relatable for your patient to get. And that's true for you too. There may be people in your family that you speak differently to, or people in your family who have disabilities, or of different kinds, or you get the idea. Everybody has so many stories. It's very rich. And I think, unfortunately, in allopathic medicine, a lot of that richness just gets pruned away just for the sake of time and efficiency and insurance requirements. And people get just down to the common denominator of having a sore throat or a bad liver or, something like that. And it's not who they are at all. Okay, I'm on a little bit of a soapbox now, but I bet those of you who work with people for a long time have had some similar experiences. Okay, I can't judge where you are in creating your genograms, but so we're going to just move on a little bit because I want to leave time for questions. Okay, so if you can move on. Okay, this was what I was just talking about. It may be that you have to deal with somebody who is most likely racist and you're a person of color, or somebody who thinks women should be, tied to the oven, or people who are anti-Semitic or homophobic, whatever it is, or you may be racist or chauvinistic or anti-Semitic or homophobic, etc. So it's important to realize that you are going to have reactions to people's behavior that's about who you are and where you come from. Okay, and that's really important because the irritation or the sense of alienation often can limit or decrease the quality of your interview. You want to get away from this person. It's a natural thing to be avoidant of somebody who doesn't like who you are. Okay, but these are patients and deserve their time with you and your best professional skill. So it's about how do you work with this? And that's a whole nother question, but it's about knowing that there are going to be people who just think that, for example, I'm white, so people assume I'm Christian, right? They assume I'm straight. I'm not Christian, I'm not straight. I live in the Bible Belt. It's easy for people to say that, but when they make assessments like that of me, in the beginning, especially when I first moved here, I went, I went tilt, because that's not who I am. And if you have personal relationships, even with good boundaries, some of that issue is still going to come up. Okay, next one, please, Sean. Okay, so again, these are some questions that I just put together in terms of a career genogram. And you can put together your own, or you can even Google some of these questions. Like, who was judged to be successful? In my family, my uncle, the physician, was the successful one, right? My brother, who is now a dentist, is a successful one. He became a dentist before I became a psychologist. So again, what occupations were valued? Medicine. What was the division of labor like in your family? Again, the women stayed home for the most part, and the men were the income producers, were the active people in the medical world for the most part, okay? Who is expected to be a caregiver, okay? I was expected to be a caregiver from a very young age. So that's probably one of the reasons why I became a psychologist, because it's a way of sublimating my tendency to take care of people in a way that could be put to use in a healthy manner. Okay, it's not just over-functioning or codependency. It's a way of honing it so I can use whatever caring I have, whatever compassion I have in a way that helps others. Okay, but again, what are the overt or subliminal messages that you got? A woman, I see most of your names look like you're women. Not everybody, of course, but or identify as women, who knows? But, there could be messages about, you can't be a physician, you have to be a nurse. Okay, because way back, men were the doctors and women were the nurses, and for example, even with a psychologist, more people will call me Miss Mark than will call my next door neighbor at work, who's a man, Mr. So-and-so. They'll say Dr. So-and-so to him, but they'll say Miss Phyllis or Miss Mark to me. And that can arouse kind of reaction. I spent half my life getting that that kind of thing. So it's important to realize that you're going to react. You're a human. You're going to have reactions, and it can be based on what the value was that was given to you in the past. Because I was raised by a pretty traditional kind of family, I was raised to be a secretary. So when somebody says miss, and I'm, in the beginning, when I first got my doctorate, especially, and they don't say doctor, it arouses a reaction based on my earlier training. Okay, I want to just go through one more, Sean, if you will, and then we'll have some minutes for questions. Okay, so this is my genogram. Again, it's pretty amateur looking, but I circled what's important. This is a 4-generation genogram because both of my great-grandfathers who were Jewish and who were in Russia were medics, because Jewish people could not become physicians in Russia in the early 20th century. So they were both medics, and one of them actually was beheaded because he went out on a sick call after curfew, and the Cossacks beheaded him. Okay, that was my maternal great-grandfather. So anyway, so if you look down, okay, my grandparents, my maternal grandfather was an entrepreneur, but my maternal grandmother was an assistant to a physician, and she learned how to make her own medicines. She did cupping, which some of you may have heard of. She made pillows that were therapeutic. She tried to help kids who had polio in the 30s. After they moved to the States in the early 20s. So in the 30s, when there was polio, she worked with them. So there's this history of female health work going on, healing, okay? My mother was civil service, which I think is interesting because an entrepreneur takes a lot of risks. So my mother and father both grew up during the Depression, which is a bigger cultural influence. So that's important. My father's younger brother, as I said, was a physician, and his next younger brother died when he was 14 from a burst appendix. So that was a huge event in my family's life. Okay, so what happened is that my grandfather didn't tell my uncle was in med school in Arkansas, which was another planet from the Bronx where I grew up. So he did not want my uncle traveling back to New York when my other uncle died, because he was afraid my uncle would not go back to medical school. So being a doctor was so important that my uncle could not attend his brother's funeral. And this was a very close family. Okay, so that is how much emphasis was put on education and becoming a physician. My dad, I told you about, and he had 2 kids. My brother applied to medical school over and over again, didn't get in. He became a successful dentist, which is still, and he works in a hospital with a lot of physicians. Okay, so he's in that environment, even though he's got a different focus. For me, with the psychologist, I started off in a different vocation, which offered a lot of stability, because both my parents were civil service and emphasized that. They were Depression kids, as I said. So I started off in a position where I felt like I could say I'm somebody, but I had this stable job, but I hated it. So I became a psychologist, but the caregiving background and the medical influences all were relevant in terms of how I made my choice. My brother has 2 kids. One of them is an EMT now. Okay, so there's a little bit of a trickle down there. So again, we have 4 generations in this picture, but I hope that just by showing you this, that's what this could look like. And you can use different colors. These double lines mean especially close relationships. If there are jagged lines, it means that people were at each other's throats. And if they're cutoffs, there's all kinds of ways that you can denote the various types of relationships that your patient has, and for yourself, actually. Dealing with loss can be a huge question to ask in the genogram, and it may be relevant for you. Okay, see all the X's in my family. I'm almost 70, so it's pretty normal to have a lot of X's with, forebears who have died. But you may have, maybe there was a sudden death. Maybe that propelled you into caregiving in a way that led you, I should say, to your present vocation. But all of these are asked with the filter of how is this relevant to who I am and what I've done. So again, this could go on for a long time. I know you don't have the time, and neither does Sean or me, but I hope that this example gives you an idea. Also, I mentioned both my parents were the oldest. They were the children of oldest parents. So that caregiving was part of this as well. I didn't mention that before, but otherwise I think I covered it. Okay, so hopefully while I've been talking, you've been thinking about these questions in the context of your own life, or saying that something didn't make sense in what I was talking about. So I would love to hear questions now. We have just about 10 minutes or so, I think, right, Sean?
We do. We've got 10 minutes, and we'll be giving out the password to the evaluation in 5 minutes. So we hope that folks will fill the time. Sometimes it takes a minute for questions to roll in through the chat. I have to say, for me, and I'm sorry to dominate, but it's fascinating to me. I am adopted, but I do know a little bit about my birth mother. And so there are things that are elements of their lives, like trauma, for example, that's not in my adopted family life. And how do you square those things?
It's definitely relevant. Okay, it's definitely relevant. And there are symbols that you can use. And then the questions that ensue are, what was the trauma, and how was it conveyed to you, and what is your reaction to it, and are there other traumas that you have dealt with, whether in your adoptive family or extended network of friends, or your own family, where there is some parallel that might be helpful to look at. And I think we had a chat question.
She was asking to repost the survey. So if you is it your conclusion then that who we are really is tied up in who we're born to?
Tied up is a very, the word
Well, it's the wrong
binary is
word.
very popular these days. It's not all or nothing, okay? It's not all or nothing. It's not tied up or it is tied up. I think all of these threads help us become the very multidimensional people that we are. So yes, heredity, yes, family history of the biological family, even if you didn't get raised by them. It's been proven that kids who are not neonates, kids just born who are not given to their biological mothers, but give to their adoptive mothers, experience grief. There's a knowledge that this is not my biological mother.
Here's a question. How would this tie in to patients who have a disease such as kidney disease?
Okay. I want to say first the answer quickly to this question about genograms give fodder to the nature versus nurture. I think it's both, and they interact. And that could be true even in somebody has a chronic illness like kidney disease, or I've worked with people with MS or with AIDS or with cancer. There can be a history. There can be a history about how people care for themselves. Many people with kidney disease are not as compliant with medical directives to keep them healthy as they could be, or not given enough support or information about that. There may be questions about any kind of humiliation or any kind of judgments that they may have or family members may have because they have to go to dialysis on a regular basis, or they have other things that they need to attend to. So it changes your life when you have kidney disease. So illness is super important. Did anybody else have kidney disease in the family? Or did anybody else have chronic disease in the family? Yeah. Yeah, you can, and you can, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, question. Ms. Peterson, is it typical to just write or note all the details in words? I have done a genogram before, but wanted to attend to get more info on how to include more details so that it can be more inclusive of needed info to use as a tool for assessment and treatment.
Okay, that's one of the hard parts. If you notice that I've put down a lot of words around people, specifically around the question I was asking about the health issue, the medical influence in terms of career choice, okay? But if you notice in the corner, I wrote immigrants who were into supporting others. Education was a priority. It was also a proof of worth if you were able to have initials after your name. It was about compensating for parents' limitations with what I told you about with my brother, idealization of my uncle who was a physician. So I wrote this stuff down on the side, and there's nothing wrong with that. Or you can make notations as I did next to people's names. That's why it's really good to have a big piece of paper. It could be 8.5 by 14, and it's also helpful if you want to take notes that are not exactly on the genogram, but could be attached to the genogram, depending on just how much, but you don't want to clog it up to a point where you can't see some of the patterns by just looking at the diagram.
What was the name of that book you referred earlier that would have, I'm assuming would have many symbols in it?
Okay, it's written on the top of the slide that has the alcoholic family overfunctioning, underfunctioning. It's Genograms, Clinical Assessment and Intervention, I believe. Yep. On top, you see Genograms, Assessment and Intervention by McGoldrick, Gerson, and Schellenberger. And as I said, Monica McGoldrick is a very well-known name in family therapy. She really advocated for genograms as a way of working with families in a much less accusatory, if you will, a much less pathologizing kind of environment. And if you want, I can write that down in the chat myself.
I will, and as we're asking for questions, I'll let folks know it's 12:57. The password for the evaluation link today is case sensitive, and it is Genogram with a capital G. That's capital GENOGRAM. That's the password for the evaluation link, which again is at https://www.surveymonkey.com/lowercase r/ all uppercase letters 6F as in Frank, W, 9Q, H as in Harry, B as in boy. We have some other questions. Oh, Miss Johnson says, thank you, very clear, exceptional. Thank you, says Austin Trahan to us. And I want to thank you, Dr. Mark. It's been a pleasure. I'd love to do Genogram 2, if you're up for it, in the future, or any other topics that I think you have obviously an abundance of practical and clinical knowledge that you could share. I'm really overjoyed to have you, and it really so nicely fits in. We've been talking in some of our more recent courses on Zoom on Mondays that we've talked about cultural competency and medical futility and other items that all require, or for which the solution is communication, and it is having the clinician communicate with the client or patient. And I think this Genogram is such a terrific tool to use, as Dr. Mark had said earlier in her presentation, to sort of draw your attention to something other than yourselves, and to this piece of paper to ask maybe some of the more difficult questions, and then of course not have to worry about feeling like you're being judged or judging them. So thank you, Dr. Mark. This is really fits the puzzle nicely.
I'm glad. I would like to cover one more comment, though, that is so important. The emphasis of this Genogram presentation is about y'all. It's about you knowing yourself and understanding where you come from and what your strengths and maybe limitations are or habits are, because once you know about yourself, you can care about yourself. And I can't think of other professions where self-care is more necessary. So I just want to emphasize that because it's not only about our patients, but if we don't take care of ourselves, our patients are in trouble. So thank you again, Sean, for having me. And I hope this has been helpful for everyone.
Oh, you've got great comments. I don't know if you've seen them. Very interesting, very useful tool, wonderful refresher, awesome. Always learn so much from my families when I do a genogram with them. With that comment, we'll close. Thank y'all for being here. Look for us to resume on August 7th. Dr. Jason Newell from the University of Montevallo will be joining us for a self-care assessment and tool as well. So look for that. Look for our email blast. Find us on our website, or find this presentation and others on YouTube by searching in the search bar once on YouTube, Sean Barnes, Care Patrol, and this will be there. Thank you again. I hope you'll have a wonderful week, and we'll hope to see you on August 7th.